Hello, my name is Theresa. Some of you may know me as McMurray Musings, and I suspect some of you think I'm here today to tell you about the blog I've been writing for the last 2 years, McMurray Musings. But I'm not going to tell you that story. I'm going to tell you the backstory. Because we all have a backstory and a reason we've ended up where we are today, and this is mine. Have you ever had a time in your life when you were unable to make a choice because you feared the outcome? A time when you were paralyzed by fear in making a decision because you feared the worst possible outcome would come from that choice. I've had that experience because it's the narrative of my life. I was an extremely anxious child. I wasn't born that way. I think it happened because I was born to a mother who suffered from a form of paranoia. The world was a scary and dangerous place for my mother. And I recognized at a very young age that the way she viewed the world was not usual. It was not normal. She needed someone to protect her, someone who could find reason and logic when she could find none, and I became that person. When I was 6 years old, my father was injured in a workplace accident. He was a grain elevator operator in rural Saskatchewan. He was caught in between two boxcars, and it fractured several vertebrae in his back. The doctors told him he would never walk again. Fortunately, the doctors were wrong. My father came home walking, but with a new addiction to painkillers because of the raging pain in his back. Pain management in the early 1970s was not an exact science. And so, very quickly, he began to self-medicate with alcohol. I went from being a child with a mother with anxiety and paranoia to a child with a mother with anxiety, paranoia, and a father with alcoholism. Shortly after my father's accident, we moved to Saskatoon. During that time, I recognized that they both now needed someone to protect them, to keep their secrets, to keep them safe from the scary and dangerous world that it had become for them, and I was that person. I was such an anxious child that I used to bite my hands, my fingers, until they were raw and bleeding. It was the only sign of what was going on in my world because I couldn't tell anyone. I needed to protect my parents. You have to understand, I wasn't afraid of them. I was afraid for them. As the years went on, my father stopped drinking. My mother continued to suffer from paranoia. And I realized that I was developing an inability to make decisions. I had begun to fear the world, and I feared the outcome of choices that I made. As a teenager, I embraced the world known as punk. Funny-colored hair, safety pins. But it was all a facade. It was a way to hide what was going on inside my world. It was the rough and tough exterior for what was happening inside. I was an excellent student. I graduated from high school with honors, and I went on to university. And after my first year at university, I ran away. I didn't run away because it wasn't going well. I ran away because it was going too well. I knew I couldn't make the decisions that I was going to soon face, career, future. And so I packed my bags and I moved to Toronto, the bravest and boldest thing I'd ever done. 2 days on a train, and by the time I arrived in Toronto, I had a twitch in my left eye that would not go away, and that lasts to this day when I am feeling anxious or tired. My years in Toronto continued to be marked by the inability to make decisions. I stayed in jobs long after I should have left with abusive employers who did not deserve me. I married someone that I loved, but long before I was ready because I was afraid to say no. When my daughter was born 13 years ago, it actually became slightly worse because now I had to make choices and decisions for her too. And I feared the outcome. I chose the safe path. The world was a scary and dangerous place. 7 years ago, my father died from lung cancer. He had been diagnosed 3 years before, and while his death was difficult and painful, I had done much of my grieving before he actually passed away, and so it did not have a significant impact on my life. 4 years ago, however, I received a phone call from my older sister. My mother was in hospital in Saskatoon. She had suffered an incident. The incident was a cerebral aneurysm. It was unlikely she would survive. It was time to go home, and so I did. I spent 5 days in the ICU with my mother. I was holding her hand when she died. And when she died, I realized that I had failed her. I had been my mother's protector, and I could not protect her from death. I thought I'd handled her death well. I didn't cry when she died. I didn't cry at her funeral, and I did not cry when I came home. But what began to happen is every morning at 3 a.m., like clockwork, I would wake up with a pain right here. It was severe, it was debilitating, and it got worse. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I lost 60 pounds in 8 months. I became convinced that I was extremely ill. In fact, I became convinced I was going to die. I thought I had cancer, most likely pancreatic cancer, the worst possible kind. If you think you're going to die, don't look on the internet. It will tell you that you are. I started to see doctors, specialists, have tests. I don't mean minor tests. I had 2 CT scans, 2 endoscopies, MRIs, ultrasounds, x-rays, lab works. I saw doctors on a weekly basis. It wasn't until I began to see my second doctor here for the second endoscopy, and he looked at me and he said, "Why are you here?" And I explained to him. All of my tests had shown that nothing was wrong. But this was the first doctor who looked at me and said, "I don't think there's anything actually wrong with you." I left that appointment that day, and I realized that maybe the pain wasn't here, and it was here. I began to see a therapist. The therapist and I discussed a lot of things. My fear of dying and abandoning my daughter the way I felt my mother had abandoned me. How I failed to protect my mother from death when I had been her protector. Slowly, the pain began to diminish. I began to eat again. I began to sleep again. I still couldn't make those decisions, though. I still wasn't living. I had begun to reclaim my life, but I wasn't living. 2 years ago, on New Year's Day, I was on an island in Ireland called Inchigoil. If you've ever been to Ireland, you know it is a magical place with many mystical spots, but Inchigoil is perhaps the most magical of them all. It is the place where St. Patrick and his shipmates were imprisoned when they came to Ireland. The pagan Irish imprisoned them there to keep them from spreading Christianity to the Irish people. While they were on Inchigoil, St. Patrick's ship navigator and nephew, Lugnad, died. As I stood in front of Lugnad's stone cross, which remains on Inchigoil to this day, I thought about St. Patrick and how he must have felt hundreds of years before, how he must have regretted coming to Ireland, and how he must have felt the worst possible outcome had happened in his life. And I think that's when it hit me, and the way I thought about the world began to change. The worst possible outcome in my life had already happened. My mother had died in a horrible, wrenching, tragic, and heartbreaking way, and I had not chosen it. I came home from Ireland, and I began to do something I hadn't done in decades. I began to write. First, I wrote in a personal blog, where I wrote a great deal about Ireland. Then, I began to write McMurray Musings, where I began to write a lot about Fort McMurray. And then I began to freelance write for anyone and everyone who would pay me, and often just for myself. You see, what I learned that day on that island in Ireland is that the worst possible things in life don't happen to us because we've chosen them. They happen to us by chance. Someday, the worst possible thing may happen to you too, but it's unlikely that you've chosen it. I look around at this audience today. I can't tell any of you the day you're going to die. I can tell you the day you're going to live because it's today. All of the days that you spend afraid to make decisions are days that you have wasted. Fear is still a companion in my life. There are days I have the eye twitch. There are days I wake up at 3 a.m. with a pain right here. Those are days when I know I need to make a decision. And often I need to decide to do the things that frighten me the most, because the things that scare me the most are often the things I most want to do. 4 years ago, my mother was alive. I was a stay-at-home wife and mom. I didn't have a job. I hadn't written in years. I couldn't make decisions, and I was not living. Today, I'm a single parent with a job that I love, a freelance writing career that excites me. I write every single day, And every single day, I make decisions that I could not have made 4 years ago, including the one that brought me to the stage today. So there you have it. That's the backstory of McMurray Musings. It's the story of a woman who spent 42 years scared to live, 1 year terrified to die, and the rest of her time just living. Thank you.